The morning of August 17th, 1943, started like every other morning at Dobodura Airfield in New Guinea. The tropical air was already thick and wet before sunrise, the kind of humidity that soaked through your uniform before you even started working. The smell of aviation fuel and hot metal hung over the flight line the way it always did. Ground crews moved between aircraft in the gray pre-dawn light, checking engines, loading ammunition belts, topping off fuel tanks. Ordinary morning, ordinary routine. Except that Technical Sergeant James McKenna hadn't slept. He stood under the left wing of a P-38 Lightning and watched a 23-year-old pilot named Robert Hayes walk out to the flight line for his pre-mission briefing. Hayes was a farm kid from Iowa. 6 combat missions, 0 kills. He was about to fly straight into 18 Japanese Zero fighters. And McKenna knew something that Hayes didn't know. Something that nobody on that airfield knew except McKenna himself. The night before, alone in a dark maintenance hangar after 11 o'clock, McKenna had reached inside the boom of Hayes's P-38 with a piece of salvaged piano wire and done something that violated every regulation in the Army Air Force maintenance manual. He had modified the flight control system of a combat aircraft without authorization, without engineering approval, without telling a single officer or inspector. If the modification failed in flight, Hayes would die and McKenna would face a court-martial. If it worked, something might change. McKenna wasn't sure which outcome was more likely. He watched Hayes climb into the cockpit, watch the engines turn over and catch, watch the P-38 taxi toward the runway, and lift into the morning sky. And then all he could do was stand on the flight line with his hands black with grease and wait to find out what he had done. What happened in the next 17 minutes over the Huon Gulf would ripple through the entire Pacific Air War in ways that nobody planned, nobody authorized, and nobody in any official capacity would ever properly acknowledge. To understand why a sergeant with a piece of piano wire mattered more than almost any engineering decision made in California that year, you have to understand the problem that everyone could see and nobody would fix. The P-38 Lightning was in many ways a remarkable aircraft. Twin engines, twin boom design, heavily armed, fast in a straight line, formidable at high altitude. American pilots loved it for what it was and lived in fear of what it wasn't. What it wasn't was a match for the Mitsubishi A6M Zero in a turning fight. The Zero was lighter, more agile, engineered from the beginning for the kind of horizontal maneuvering that dominated close-range dogfighting in the Pacific. In a full horizontal turn, the Zero could complete the circle in roughly half the time a P-38 needed. In a dogfight, that difference was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. American doctrine addressed this with a simple rule that was drilled into every P-38 pilot from the moment they arrived in theater. Never turn with a Zero. Never try to outmaneuver it. Use what the P-38 had that the Zero didn't, which was speed, altitude, and firepower. Dive in from above, get a quick burst. Climb away before the Zero could react. Hit and run. Stay out of the turning fight entirely. The doctrine was logical. The doctrine was correct. The doctrine was also, in the chaos and speed of actual aerial combat, against experienced Japanese pilots who had been flying and fighting since before Pearl Harbor, almost impossible to follow consistently. The Zeros were not passive targets waiting to be bounced from altitude. Their pilots were skilled and adaptable, many of them veterans with years of combat experience over China and the Pacific. They understood American doctrine because they had been watching American pilots try to execute it for months. They knew how to bait a P-38 pilot into a position where instinct overrode training, where the turning fight began before the American fully realized he was in one. By mid-1943, the 5th Air Force had lost 37 P-38s in 6 weeks, the majority of them shot down after being caught in turning engagements they couldn't escape. The official reports called it pilot error. The instructors said the pilots weren't following doctrine. The pilots who survived said something different. They said the airplane felt slow. They said there was a delay between moving the stick and the aircraft actually responding. A lag that was small enough to be invisible in normal flight, but large enough, in the split second of a hard reversal against a Zero that was already inside your turning radius, to get you killed. McKenna had known about the lag for months. He had felt it with his own hands every time he tensioned the aileron control cables during routine maintenance. The P-38s aileron cables ran from the cockpit through the twin booms to the tail section, then forward through a series of pulleys to the wing control surfaces. The system had slack built into it. Not much, roughly 3/8 of an inch at full deflection, a tolerance that the engineering specifications explicitly permitted, a number that the factory in California had signed off on as acceptable. But that fraction of an inch of slack created a measurable delay between stick input and aileron response. At cruise speeds in straight and level flight, it was imperceptible. During hard maneuvering at lower speeds, during the exact kind of frantic rolling and reversing that dogfighting with Zeros required, that delay translated to roughly a fraction of a second of lag between what the pilot commanded and what the aircraft did. A fraction of a second that an experienced Zero pilot, one who had learned the precise timing of P-38 control response through months of combat observation, could exploit with the accuracy of a musician hitting a note he had practiced 10,000 times. McKenna had brought this to the engineering officer 2 months earlier. He had explained it carefully, had demonstrated the slack with his hands, had described what he believed it was doing to pilots in combat. The officer had listened politely and told him that the cable tension was within factory specifications, that Lockheed's engineering team in Burbank had approved those tolerances, that modifying flight control systems in the field required engineering authorization that could only come from the manufacturer, and that the manufacturer was 7,000 miles away in California. The conversation was over. McKenna went back to the flight line. The pilots kept dying. The first one he lost was Lieutenant David Chen. July 9th, 1943. Chen had been in theater 3 weeks. He was from Sacramento. McKenna was from Long Beach. They had talked about California during pre-flight checks, talked about cars, talked about the kind of ordinary life that felt very far away in New Guinea. On July 9th, Chen flew a fighter sweep over Leh, came back 2 hours later with 3 bullet holes in his left boom, and a story about a Zero that had gotten inside his turn. He told McKenna that he had tried to roll out and dive away the moment the Zero reversed on him, exactly the way the manual said, but the airplane had felt slow to respond. Like there was a delay between the stick and the aircraft. Though like the airplane knew what he wanted, but took just a moment too long to do it. A moment long enough for the Zero pilot to calculate the deflection perfectly and put 3 rounds exactly where Chen was going to be. Chen's wingman had shot the Zero off his tail. Chen had survived. 3 weeks later, McKenna heard that Chen had been killed over Rabaul. Same story. Caught in a turning fight. Couldn't roll out fast enough. The second was Captain William Morrison. Morrison was everything Chen wasn't in terms of experience. 11 confirmed kills. A flight leader. A pilot who knew the P-38's limitations as well as anyone in the theater and flew accordingly. On August 3rd, Morrison's flight intercepted 8 Zeros at 12,000 feet over Oro Bay. Morrison got one on the first pass, came around for another run, had 2 Zeros reverse on him simultaneously. His wingman heard him call out on the radio that his controls felt mushy. The Zeros stayed with him through his escape maneuver, shot him down at 4,000 feet. The official report said pilot error. Morrison's crew chief, a man named Rodriguez from Texas who had worked on that specific aircraft for months, went through the recovered wreckage piece by piece, looking for a mechanical explanation. Every measurement he took was within specification. There was nothing wrong with the airplane. The airplane had simply not responded quickly enough at the moment Morrison needed it most. and the specifications said that was acceptable, and Morrison was dead. McKenna and Rodriguez talked about it one evening, sitting outside the maintenance area after the rest of the crew had gone to sleep. Rodriguez asked what could be done. McKenna told him there was an unofficial solution. He described the slack, described what needed to happen to eliminate it, described the risk of doing it without authorization. Rodriguez looked at him for a long time. Then he said he understood and walked back to his bunk. He never asked McKenna about it again. McKenna understood. Rodriguez had a family. McKenna did too. There were limits to how much of your future you could gamble on a piece of wire and a good intention. What changed everything was Lieutenant Thomas Parker. 21 years old, from Boston, Hayes's wingman, the pilot who had gone through training with Hayes, and bunked next to him and laughed at the same bad jokes in the ready room. On August 14th, Parker got separated from his formation during a dogfight over Finschhafen. My 2 Zeros got behind him. Parker tried everything the manual prescribed, everything training had taught him, every defensive maneuver available to a P-38 pilot in trouble. He rolled hard, reversed, tried to scissor, tried to create angles the Zeros couldn't follow. The Zeros followed everything. Hayes heard it on the radio, heard Parker calling for help, heard the panic that had replaced the voice of the young man from Boston, who had been perfectly calm in every other situation Hayes had seen him in. Heard Parker say his airplane wasn't turning fast enough. Heard the gunfire in the background of the transmission. Heard Parker scream. Heard nothing after that. Parker's bed stayed empty. His personal effects were packed and shipped home. His P-38 was written off as a combat loss with a maintenance log that noted no mechanical issues. McKenna had done the pre-flight inspection on that aircraft the morning Parker died. He had checked every system, verified every reading, signed his name to the maintenance log. The airplane was fine, and Parker was dead. And the cable slack was 3/8 of an inch, within specification, exactly where the factory said it was supposed to be. The evening of August 16th, Hayes found McKenna in the maintenance area. Hayes had been awake since Parker died 2 days earlier. His eyes showed it. He stood in front of McKenna and asked, without any particular drama or ceremony, if there was anything McKenna could do to make the airplane roll faster. Anything at all. He said he didn't care about regulations. He said he just wanted a chance. He said it the way a man says something when he has accepted that the alternative to asking is dying, and he would rather take whatever risk came with asking. McKenna looked at him for a moment. Then he told Hayes to come back in the morning. The maintenance hangar after 11 o'clock at night was a different place from the hangar during the working day. During the day, it was loud and crowded and alive with the organized chaos of aircraft being serviced and repaired and made ready for combat. After 11, it was quiet in a way that felt almost fragile. Just the distant hum of generators and the high, constant buzz of tropical insects against the overhead lights, and the smell of engine oil and hydraulic fluid and the thick, wet heat of a New Guinea night. McKenna worked alone. He pulled the inspection panel off the left boom of Hayes's P-38 and reached inside and found the aileron control cable and pulled on it with both hands. Felt the slack. 3/8 of an inch of play before the tension caught, before the control surface at the other end actually began to move. He had felt this hundreds of times on dozens of aircraft. He had always noted it and moved on because moving on was what the regulations required. Tonight was different. The piano wire had come from a P-38 that had ground looped 2 weeks earlier and been written off as scrap. McKenna had salvaged parts from it before it went to the depot, the way mechanics always salvaged useful things from broken machines. And one of the things he had kept without knowing exactly why was a 6-inch piece of high-tensile piano wire from the rudder trim system. It had been sitting in the bottom of his tool bag. He took it out now and sat on the hangar floor with it, and a pair of pliers, and began bending it into a Z shape. The wire was stiff and resisted the pliers, and his hands slipped twice. The second time, the wire edge caught his thumb and opened a small cut. The blood made the wire slippery. He wiped his hand on his coveralls and kept working. 8 minutes to get the bend right. The Z-shape would act as an inline tensioner, adding just enough preload to the cable to take out the slack completely, to make the system respond the instant it received a command, rather than a fraction of a second after. Installing it was harder than making it. And the space inside the boom was narrow and dark, and his flashlight kept moving, and the shadows jumped, and his shoulder was wedged against the boom structure, hard enough to cut through his coveralls into the skin underneath. He disconnected the cable at the pulley junction, and the clevis pin dropped out of his fingers, and he heard it bounce and roll somewhere in the darkness inside the boom. He spent 5 minutes reaching around in the dark, heart pounding, before his fingers closed on it. The whole time he was thinking about the court-martial, about what an unauthorized modification to a flight control system meant in terms of regulations, in terms of the military justice system, in terms of what happened to your life if the modification failed in flight and a pilot died and the investigation found your name in the maintenance log. But the whole time he was also thinking about Parker's voice on the radio saying the airplane wasn't turning fast enough. He inserted the piano wire tensioner between the cable end and the pulley, reconnected the cable, forced the clevis pin through the tight fit until it seated. He tested the tension by pulling the cable with his hand. No slack. The control surface moved the instant he applied pressure. Perfect. He replaced the inspection panel, gathered his tools, wiped the blood off the wire and off his hands, and walked out of the hangar at 1:15 in the morning. He walked to his bunk and lay on his back and looked at the ceiling until the sky outside began to lighten. He didn't sleep. Hayes took off at 7:42 in the morning. McKenna stood on the flight line and watched the P-38 climb and bank and join the formation of 16 other aircraft heading northwest toward Japanese airspace. He watched until they were gone, and then he stayed on the flight line because there was nowhere else he wanted to be, nothing else that felt worth doing until he knew. The wait was 32 minutes. The engagement started at 8:14. Hayes's flight of 4 P-38s found 9 Zeros at 13,000 feet over the Huon Gulf with the morning sun at their backs. The ideal setup for a diving attack. Hayes was flying number 3 position. His element leader called the bounce. They rolled in. Hayes picked a 0 at the back of the Japanese formation and dove, building speed to 380 miles per hour. The target growing in his gun sight until he could see the rising sun painted on the fuselage, could see the outline of the pilot's head in the cockpit. He pressed the trigger. The 4 50 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon fired together, and the tracers reached out, and a few rounds sparked off the Zero's wing. Not enough. The Zero snap-rolled right and dove to escape. Hayes rolled to follow, and that was the moment everything was different. The airplane moved the instant he moved the stick. No delay, no lag, no fraction of a second of the aircraft catching up to what his hands were telling it. He rolled 90 degrees in what felt like half the time he had ever managed before, got his nose down, and the Zero was right there in his sight picture, perfectly framed, going nowhere he didn't expect it to go. He fired a 3-second burst. The rounds walked up the Zero's fuselage from tail to cockpit, and the engine exploded, and pieces came off the aircraft and it rolled inverted and fell toward the jungle below, trailing a column of black smoke. Hayes's first kill. 8 weeks of combat, 6 missions, 0 kills, and now this, in under a minute. Because the airplane had done exactly what he asked it to do, at exactly the moment he asked it. There was no time to process any of it because his wingman was calling out 3 Zeros, diving from above, coming fast, having watched their formation mate go down, and now coming for the man who had shot him. Hayes pushed the throttles forward and started to climb, and immediately understood he wasn't going to make it. The Zeros were already in their dive, already fast, already close. Every instinct told him to keep climbing, keep running, maintain speed and altitude, follow the doctrine. Doctrine said, living. But doctrine also said, turning with Zeros meant dying, and he was out of options. and out of time. He rolled hard, left and pulled. The P-38 snapped around like a different aircraft. Like something had been removed from the control system. Some invisible resistance that he had been fighting against without ever fully knowing it was there. The nose came through the horizon, and he saw the lead Zero, already in its turn to follow him, already committed to an angle that had been calculated on the assumption that Hayes's P-38 would move the way P-38s always moved. It hadn't. The Zero was exposed, caught in a bad position by a reversal it hadn't predicted. And Hayes pulled lead and fired and hit the Zero in the left wing root, and the wing folded and the aircraft tumbled out of the sky. 2 kills, 30 seconds. The remaining 2 Zeros tried to scissor with him. The classic defensive tactic of alternating hard turns to force an overshoot and create a shot opportunity. Hayes matched every reversal. Every time the Zeros changed direction, his P-38 snapped into the new turn immediately. No delay, no fighting the controls. The aircraft doing what he wanted the moment he wanted it, in a way it had never done before in any of his previous 6 missions. 1 Zero made an error, reversed too aggressively, lost too much speed, ended up exposed at close range. Hayes fired from 200 feet. He couldn't miss. The Zero came apart. Pieces of it struck his right boom as they flew past. 3 kills in 7 minutes. The 4th Zero ran, and Hayes let it go because he was low on fuel and ammunition, and because 3 was already something he was going to need time to understand. He landed at Dobodura at 9 o'clock in the morning, and taxied to the flight line, and shut down the engines, and climbed out of the cockpit, with shaking hands, and a flight suit, soaked through with sweat, and walked directly to where McKenna was standing. He looked at McKenna for a moment. Then he said 2 words. It worked. Neither of them knew yet that 6 other pilots had been watching. Captain Frank Mitchell had observed the entire engagement from 15,000 feet. Mitchell was a flight leader in the 475th Fighter Group, a man with enough time in P-38s to know exactly what they looked like during hard maneuvering, exactly what their normal roll rate was, exactly what the aircraft should have been doing in the kind of turning fight Hayes had just survived and won. What he had watched through the morning sky over the Huon Gulf didn't match any of that. Hayes's P-38 had been snapping through direction changes at a rate that Mitchell had never seen from a Lightning. It had moved like something lighter, something more responsive, something that wasn't quite the aircraft Mitchell had been flying and fighting in for months. Mitchell knew Hayes, knew his skill level. Hayes was good. He wasn't this good. Something was different about the airplane. Mitchell found Hayes in the debriefing room 2 hours after landing. Hayes was still running on adrenaline, still processing 3 kills in 7 minutes, his hand moving as he filled out the combat report. Mitchell asked him what had changed. Hayes said his airplane had just responded differently today, faster. Mitchell asked if maintenance had done anything to the aircraft. Hayes told him to find Technical Sergeant McKenna. McKenna was in the maintenance area when Mitchell arrived, working on a different P-38, hands black with grease, coverall stained with hydraulic fluid. Mitchell asked him directly what he had done to Hayes's airplane. McKenna looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look you give someone when you're calculating what honesty is going to cost you. Then he told Mitchell everything: the piano wire, the Z-bend, the cable tensioner installed in the dark with a cut thumb and a pounding heart, the unauthorized modification to a flight control system that violated every regulation in the maintenance manual. Mitchell listened to all of it without interrupting. When McKenna finished, Mitchell asked one question: "Can you do the same thing to my aircraft?" McKenna said yes, but Mitchell needed to understand the risks. The modification wasn't approved, wasn't tested, wasn't in any manual. If something went wrong, they were both facing serious charges. Mitchell said he had lost 4 pilots in his flight in the past month, all of them caught in turning fights they couldn't escape. If there was something that might keep his pilots alive, regulations could wait. That evening, McKenna modified Mitchell's P-38. Mitchell flew it the next morning and came back to the field, telling his wingman that his aircraft now rolled like a fighter instead of a truck. The wingman told McKenna he wanted the same modification, and the one after that. And by August 20th, 3 days after Hayes's first kills, McKenna had modified 9 aircraft, and the modification was moving through the squadron the way information moves when it matters. Quietly, urgently, person to person, completely outside any official channel. Pilots told crew chiefs. Crew chiefs who were willing showed other crew chiefs. The ones who refused on regulatory grounds were not judged, just bypassed. McKenna showed anyone who asked how to cut the wire, how to make the Z-bend, how to thread the tensioner into the boom and seat the clivus pin without dropping it in the dark. Takes 8 minutes, he told them. Changes everything. The only problem was the inspections, which happened regularly and which measured cable tension. The solution to that was simple and immediate and required no discussion. The crew chiefs removed the tensioners before inspections and reinstalled them afterward. The inspection results came back clean because the aircraft were clean during inspections. The officers signed off on the paperwork. The modification that didn't exist continued to change how the aircraft flew. Hayes shot down 2 more Zeros on August 22nd. Mitchell got 3 on August 25th. Other pilots began coming back from missions with kills and with stories about their aircraft suddenly doing things they hadn't expected it to be able to do. About reversals working that hadn't worked before. About surviving situations that had killed better pilots in previous weeks. The statistics began to shift in ways that showed up in reports without any accompanying explanation. In July, the kill ratio for P-38s against Zeros in the Southwest Pacific had been roughly 1 American aircraft lost for every 2 Zeros destroyed. By August, it was 1.3 to 1. By September, it was approaching even. Something was happening, and it was measurable, and nobody in any official capacity knew what it was. By early September, roughly 40 P-38s in New Guinea were flying with the modification installed. The engineering officer at Dobadura noticed that his cable tension readings were coming back unusually consistent and clean, slightly cleaner than they had been before, but attributed it to improved maintenance standards and moved on. The Japanese noticed before the Americans officially did. Japanese flight reports from the 11th Air Fleet began noting the change in late August. The reports described American P-38s maneuvering with uncharacteristic aggression, rolling faster into turns, reversing direction more quickly than the aircraft's known performance envelope should have permitted. The reports were initially dismissed as combat stress distorting pilot perception. Then, more reports came in saying the same things, and the dismissal became harder to sustain. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai had 64 confirmed kills and had been fighting American pilots since the first day of the Pacific War. He was one of the most experienced and capable fighter pilots Japan had produced, a man who had survived against longer and longer odds as the quality of American pilots improved and the supply of experienced Japanese aviators diminished. On September 3, 1943, Sakai engaged a P-38 over Wewak and used the tactic that had worked reliably against American Lightnings for months. He drew the American into a turning fight, waited for the P-38 to commit to its role, then snapped his own turn sharply in the opposite direction to get inside the American's turning radius, the move that exploited the gap between what the P-38 pilot wanted to do and when the aircraft actually did it. He had executed this maneuver dozens of times. He knew the timing the way he knew the sound of his own engine. The P-38 should have taken just slightly too long to reverse, and he should have ended up behind it with a clean shot. The P-38 reversed with him. Not almost with him. Not close enough to make it interesting. It reversed simultaneously, matching his direction change at a rate that Sakai's entire accumulated experience told him was not possible. He barely avoided a collision. The American got his guns pointing in Sakai's direction, and Sakai had to dive away from an engagement that he had entered with every advantage on his side. He returned to his base deeply unsettled in a way that combat experience is supposed to prevent. Something had changed about that aircraft, and he could not identify what it was. He filed a report. Other experienced Japanese pilots filed similar reports. American P-38s were somehow different from the P-38s they had been fighting a month earlier. Something in their handling had changed. The change was fractional, but it was consistent, and it was enough to disrupt the timing that Japanese pilots had spent months learning to exploit with lethal precision. Japanese intelligence analyzed wreckage from downed P-38s looking for modifications. They found nothing. The aircraft looked identical to the ones they had been destroying all summer. Same engines, same armament, same airframe dimensions, same visible components. They couldn't counter something they couldn't identify. They were developing new tactics against an enemy that had changed in a way they could feel but couldn't see. And that is one of the most disorienting experiences available to a fighter pilot in combat. The psychological effect inside Japanese fighter units was something that accumulated rather than arrived all at once. For 2 years, Zero pilots had operated with the certainty that in a turning fight, they owned the sky. That certainty was fundamental to how they flew, how they made decisions in the fraction of a second available for decisions in combat, how much risk they were willing to accept because they knew what the outcome of a turning fight would be. That certainty began eroding in September 1943. Pilots who had always pressed their attacks started hesitating. Tactics that had produced kills in July were producing near collisions and narrow escapes in September. Several experienced Japanese pilots were killed in September, trying maneuvers that had worked perfectly 6 weeks earlier. Killed because the timing that their experience had refined to a precise instrument had stopped working without warning or explanation. Some Japanese pilots adapted by abandoning turning fights with P-38s entirely, shifting to hit-and-run tactics that surrendered the Zero's main advantage in exchange for survivability. The problem with this adaptation was that it meant fighting on American terms. And on American terms, the P-38 was faster, more heavily armed, more durable, and could absorb far more damage than the Zero. Choosing to fight that way was accepting a disadvantage in exchange for avoiding a greater one. And experienced pilots understood what that calculation meant about the direction the air war was heading. By the end of September, the 11th Air Fleet had lost 38 fighters in engagements with P-38s. American P-38 losses in the same period were 22 aircraft. The ratio had reversed. For the first time in the Pacific Air War, P-38s were killing Zeros at better than a 1-to-1 rate. Japanese command issued an order that would have been unthinkable earlier in the year, instructing pilots to avoid engaging P-38s unless they held significant numerical advantage. That order was the moment the Zero went from predator to prey over the skies of New Guinea. And the thing that changed it was inside a boom, invisible to inspection, unmentioned in any report, a modification that officially did not exist, and it couldn't stay invisible forever. In October 1943, a maintenance inspector at Dobodura, conducting a routine audit, noticed something odd. Cable tension readings across the squadron were coming back unusually consistent, almost too clean, in a way that didn't match the natural variation in aircraft that had been flying combat missions in tropical conditions. He pulled inspection panels and found piano wire tensioners on multiple aircraft. He wrote a report and sent it up the chain of command. The report landed on several desks in sequence and stayed on each one for longer than reports usually stay, because nobody was quite sure what to do with it. The modification violated regulations. It was also, by any honest reading of the kill ratio statistics over the preceding 2 months, working. The question of what to do with a regulation violation that was keeping American pilots alive was not a question that the Army Air Force Maintenance Manual provided clear guidance on. The report made its way up to the level where decisions got made, and a decision was made to bring in the manufacturer. In November 1943, Lockheed sent an engineering team to New Guinea. They examined the modification, measured the cable tension with and without it, calculated the stress loads on the affected components, ran flight tests with instrumented aircraft, and produced a technical assessment. Their conclusion was precise and somewhat embarrassing. The modification was safe. It was effective. The improved aileron response it produced was measurable and significant, and it should have been part of the original design. Beyond the slack that the factory specifications had permitted, the 3/8 of an inch that every inspector had measured as within tolerance for 2 years, while pilots died in turning fights they couldn't escape, should never have been there. The fix that a sergeant had improvised on a hangar floor, with a piece of salvaged piano wire and a pair of pliers in 8 minutes at 1 o'clock in the morning, was the correct engineering solution to a design flaw that Lockheed's own engineers had not identified. Lockheed integrated a revised cable tensioning system into the P-38J model that entered production in December 1943. The improvement was attributed in official documentation to engineering analysis conducted in response to field performance data. McKenna's name did not appear in the documentation. There was no commendation, no medal, no letter of recognition, no formal acknowledgement of any kind that a technical sergeant at Dobodura had identified and solved the problem before the manufacturer did, had done it at personal risk and without authorization, had spread the solution through an entire theater of operations through whispered conversations and borrowed wire, while the official channels were still deciding whether to take the report seriously. The official record described an engineering improvement. The official record was accurate in every respect, except the most important one. Hayes survived the war. He flew 63 combat missions in total and shot down 11 Japanese aircraft and returned to Iowa in 1945 and married his high school sweetheart and had 4 children and spent 37 years crop dusting fields in the same flat Midwestern landscape he had grown up in, flying low and slow over corn and soybean fields in aircraft that bore no resemblance to the P-38 Lightning, except that they were also machines that a man trusted with his life. Every year on August 17th, without fail, from 1945 until the end of his life, Hayes called McKenna on the telephone. The calls were not long. Hayes was not a man who used many words to say things, but he made the call. Every year. The same date. Because some debts don't get smaller with time, and some moments don't recede the way ordinary moments do. And Hayes had never forgotten what it felt like when his P-38 snapped into that first reversal over the Huon Gulf, and the aircraft finally, fully, completely, did what he needed it to do. Mitchell survived as well. He rose to squadron commander, led his unit through the Philippines campaign, added 16 more kills to his total, retired from the Air Force as a colonel in 1963. He told the story of McKenna's modification to every young maintenance officer who served under him, made it part of how he thought about the relationship between the people who flew aircraft and the people who kept them flying. He was consistent and emphatic about the lesson. The best solutions in war do not come from engineering committees and official processes. They come from the people closest to the problem, the people whose hands are on the machines every morning, the people who hear what the cables sound like when the tension is wrong, and who lie awake at night, knowing that wrong is killing people they know. McKenna left the Army Air Force in 1946 and went back to Long Beach and back to what he had always done with his hands and his understanding of how machines work. He opened a garage in 1948 and worked on engines for 42 years. He was good at it in the same way he had been good at maintaining P-38s, which was the way of a man who listened to machines rather than just following the manual, who heard the difference between right and wrong in a sound or a feel or a tension that the specifications said was acceptable. He did not talk much about the war. When people asked, he said he had been a mechanic, fixed airplanes. That was all. In 1991, a military historian researching P-38 performance modifications in the Pacific Theater found references to an unauthorized cable tensioner in maintenance logs from Dobodura. The references were brief and fragmentary, the kind of paper trail left by something that was never meant to be documented. The historian tracked McKenna through veteran registries. McKenna was 73 years old and still working part-time in his garage. The historian drove to Long Beach and found him with grease on his hands, which was apparently the natural state of the man. He asked McKenna about the piano wire tensioner. McKenna confirmed the story, filling in details that no document had recorded. The hanger at 1 a.m, the dropped clevis pin, the cut thumb. The question he had asked himself over and over while he lay on his bunk watching the ceiling until dawn. Whether it would work, whether Hayes would come back, whether the thing he had done in the dark with a piece of salvaged wire was going to matter. The historian's subsequent research estimated that the modification, across all the aircraft it was applied to, in the months between August and December 1943, before the corrected design was incorporated into production aircraft, had likely contributed to saving between 80 and 100 American pilots' lives. McKenna listened to the number when the historian told him. Then he said he had never counted. He remembered the pilots who came back, Hayes, Mitchell, the others. That was enough. James McKenna died on a morning in 2006, at 88 years old. Mush in the city he had grown up in and returned to, and spent most of his life in. He was buried in Pacific View Memorial Park. His obituary noted his World War II service as an aircraft mechanic. It did not mention the piano wire. It did not mention Hayes, or Mitchell, or the engagement over the Huon Gulf on August 17, 1943, or the shift and kill ratios through the autumn of that year, or the Lockheed engineering report that confirmed what a sergeant had already known, or the 80 to 100 young men who came home because of something improvised in a dark hangar with a cut thumb and a borrowed piece of wire and a refusal to accept that within specification was the same thing as good enough. His garage in Long Beach is still there under different ownership. In the back office there is a faded photograph on the wall. A young man in mechanic's coveralls standing beside a P-38 Lightning on a flight line. The light in the photograph has the particular quality of tropical morning light, the kind that exists in New Guinea and nowhere else. On the back of the photograph, written in pencil and handwriting that is faded but remains legible, is a date. August 1943, New Guinea. No explanation, no caption, just the date and the aircraft, and the young man who understood that the gap between what a machine was doing and what it should be doing was not a specification to be accepted, but a problem to be solved, and who solved it in the only way available to him, alone in the dark with what he had, without permission, without recognition, and without hesitation. That is how wars actually turn. Not always on the decisions of generals, or the innovations of engineers, or the strategies of governments. Sometimes on the decision of one man on one night who looks at a cable with 3/8 of an inch of slack and decides that acceptable is not the same thing as right, and picks up a piece of wire and starts bending.